When it comes to shooter, shoot-'em-up, or shmup games, many people think of the larger series like Gradius, R-Type, Gaiares, and Thunder Force. But the genre is known for having plenty of hidden gems that are often obscured by its larger, more popular titles. One of these hidden gems is known as Gaiares, a unique shooter that relied on plenty of mechanics established by some of its more popular shoot-'em-up predecessors, but also employed a newer concept that helped set itself apart from them. Many may be more familiar with the game from its somewhat bizarre and ridiculous North American magazine advertisements that featured quote-unquote professional gamer Jamie Bunker. But underneath all of that lies a unique and extremely challenging game that can bring even the most skilled shmup veterans to tears. This is the story of the 2D Japanese shooter that never quite pushed itself into the mainstream, and of the two men responsible for creating it. This is the story of Gaiares. In the mid-1980s, two young men got their start in the video game industry working at developer Nihon Telenet on titles like Valis, Exile, and the computer versions of Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei. Their names were Koji Yokota and Masayasu Yamamoto. Yokota excelled at graphic design and sprite art, while Yamamoto was a very accomplished programmer. Yokota eventually left Telenet after a few years and moved to Nihon Falcom, with the majority of his time at the company spent developing Ys 3, Wanderers from Ys, alongside soon-to-be Quintet co-founders Masaya Hashimoto and Tomoyoshi Miyazaki. These two would leave the company shortly after Ys 3's completion and create ActRaiser for the Super NES, under their own independent studio called Quintet. Yokota would follow suit not long after their departure and left Falcom to work in the Japanese game industry as an independent freelance contractor. Meanwhile, Yamamoto remained at Telenet, which was divided into three teams: Lasersoft, Wolf Team, and Renovation Game. Lasersoft focused on developing software for the PC Engine CD/TurboGrafx CD. Wolf Team would briefly go independent for a few years before being folded back into the company, and Renovation Game, who Yamamoto worked under, was simply the main Telenet team rebranded under a new name. Around 1989, Sega approached Telenet about creating a game for their brand new Mega Drive console, known as the Genesis in the US. With the console launching soon outside of Japan, Telenet wanted this new project to be created with a focus on the Western market. Renovation would handle development of the game, and a decision was eventually made that the title would be a 2D shooter. Yamamoto would be put in charge of the project, but he did not currently have a team for it, so he sought some outside help. Yokota had just left Falcom around this time to begin his freelancing career, so Yamamoto approached his former Telenet colleague about joining him for the development of this new Sega exclusive title, not just as an artist, but as a game designer as well. Yokota was intrigued by the project and agreed to come on board, especially since he didn't have any other freelance work scheduled until later down the road. This new shooter's development would not take place in an office, but instead a small Japanese apartment rented by Telenet that Yamamoto would live and work in for the duration of the project. This was done so that he could constantly labor away on the game for long hours, even well into the night, without ever needing to leave his residence. During the early sections of production, the team consisted of only Yokota and Yamamoto, who slowly pieced together their concepts for the project. Shinobu Ogawa would join later, however, as the title's music composer. The game would need to fit on a 4 megabit cartridge, so they would need to be careful not to get too overzealous with the scope of the game and its graphics. Its story took place in the year 3008. The Earth had now become an uninhabitable planet due to the buildup of radioactive waste and environmental destruction. A terrorist organization named Gulfer was attempting to harvest the Earth's waste, using it to create powerful weapons and threaten the galaxy. The Empire of the Lizalith star cluster tasked humanity with stopping Gulfer's plans and thwarting their weapon creation efforts. If humanity failed, Lizalith would destroy the solar system's sun and the Earth along with it. But if they succeeded, they would restore the planet to its former unpolluted and once more habitable glory. Originally, the game was worked on under the name Azita before Yokota came up with what would be its finalized title, Gaiares, pronounced Gaiares in Japan. Gaia obviously referred to the Earth, and res was meant to be the English word less, which when pronounced in Japanese would be said as resu. So technically, Gaiares should have been called Gaiares in English. This title was meant to represent humanity's loss of the Earth in the game's story, after it had become an uninhabitable wasteland. Its gameplay would pull much of its inspiration from shooters like Gradius and R-Type. The player's ship would have an option module referred to in-game as the TOZ system, or simply TOZ, that, much like in Gradius, would follow the ship's path and emulate its shots. Similar to R-Type, the TOZ could also block bullets and be shot out to damage enemies. Unlike Gradius and R-Type though, the ship's speed could be increased or decreased by the player at will. Initially, the plan was to make it so that the player could switch through the different weapons in real time, much like its speed controls, before Yokota and Yamamoto decided on a mechanic that would make Gaiares much more unique. When shooting out the TOZ at most enemies, the module would attach briefly to its foe and copy its weapon ability, allowing for the player to now use it as their own. The more of that enemy the player drained weapon data from, the stronger the equipped weapon would become. This mechanic was built as a risk-reward system, since the player's ship would be much more vulnerable and unable to fire when sending the TOZ out, especially with the added time it took to drain weapon data from enemies. With Gaiares' more Western-developed focus, Nihon Telnet's United States office and publishing branch, Renovation Products, had been pushing the small development team to make the title very difficult, as the North American market was quite notorious for simply renting and completing games instead of purchasing them. When Renovation Products finally got their hands on an already very challenging demo of Gaiares, they instructed Yamamoto to crank up its difficulty even higher, leading to some tremendously tough and unforgiving gameplay that tested even the most seasoned of shooter veterans. Gaiares consisted of 8 separate stages, with each containing its own boss and a handful of mini-bosses scattered throughout the game. These stages had some very interesting environments and obstacles, like giant medieval guillotines, gravity-altering black holes, and scattered space crystals. Yokota handled much of the graphic design and sprite work for the first 6 stages, but during production, a decision was made to double the memory of Gaiares' cartridge from 4 megabits to 8. This increase would add more content to the game, but also lengthened its development schedule quite a bit. Yokota had already accepted another freelance job that would conflict with this lengthened timeline, and was saddened to be unable to see Gaiares' production to the finish line. Yamamoto would work with other designers at Renovation Game to see the last 2 stages brought to completion, though many of the sprites found in them were simply reused enemies from the first 6 levels, making them unfortunately feel somewhat tacked on. The extended development time also let Yamamoto and his team add an extensive amount of story cutscenes near the end of the project's deadline. In fact, the majority of the now doubled cartridge memory was mostly used to hold the nearly 10 minutes of intro and ending cutscenes found in the game. This was a rarity for a shoot-'em-up title, especially one on a home console, which helped Gaiares stand out even more from other shooters at the time. The game launched first in Japan in late December of 1990 for the Sega Mega Drive, to mostly average reviews. It then released in its target market of North America a few months later in spring of 1991, with very different cover art from its Japanese counterpart. The game received much more favorable reviews from critics outside of Japan, with GamePro magazine even going so far as to give the title a perfect score. Renovation Products spent nearly 8 months running ads for Gaiares in various gaming magazines, all of which featured Jamie Bunker, a young mullet-clad game tester at the company who at that point still hadn't even graduated high school. Bunker was billed in these magazine advertisements as being a quote-unquote professional gamer, which technically wasn't wrong given his position as a game tester, and one who gave Gaiares his full endorsement. Renovation Products continued running magazine ads for the game even many months after its North American release, attempting to entice gamers into purchasing the title. Its final marketing effort happened nearly 7 months after it had first hit store shelves, and offered a free Gaiares t-shirt that read, "Can you say Guy are us?" when purchasing the title at participating retailers. This particular advertisement became somewhat famous for being so ridiculous in its presentation, with many people remembering Gaiares not for its unique gameplay, graphics, and cutscenes, but instead for its unorthodox and somewhat awkward magazine advertisements. Jamie Bunker eventually left the gaming industry not too long after Gaiares' release, but continued working in the field of technology. He has communicated with journalists about the ad over the years and still remains proud of his 15 minutes of fame even to this day. Both Koji Yokota and Masayasu Yamamoto continued working in the Japanese video game industry for many decades after Gaiares. Yokota would go on to help develop games like ActRaiser, Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia/Illusion of Time, and Lunar Eternal Blue. He even helped establish Quintet's spin-off studio, Shade. Yamamoto remained working as a programmer and designer on titles like Alundra 2 and the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series. Gaiares sadly never received a sequel, nor gained much popularity outside of a small cult following over the years. It did, however, receive a special edition re-release published by Retrobit in 2022, over 3 decades after its initial release, that partnered once more with a now much older Jamie Bunker, sans his mullet. This special edition set contained a copy of the game, an exclusive interview with Jamie Bunker, a certificate of authenticity, and a t-shirt recreated from its iconic promotional magazine advertisement. Gaiares may not have been the most popular title on Sega's 16-bit console, but it still stands the test of time as a unique, incredibly challenging shoot-'em-up with impressive graphics and cutscenes made by just a few guys out of a small apartment in Japan.